Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the 15th century, which was, let's be honest, not a great time to make mistakes, or to be accused of making mistakes, or really to exist near anyone who had the authority to punish you. So go ahead and get comfortable, dim those lights, maybe adjust your pillow situation, because we're about to spend the next hour and a half exploring some truly creative ways that people in the 1400s decided to hurt each other. Legally. Now, the 15th century sits in this interesting pocket of history where medieval brutality was still going strong, but people were starting to get, shall we say, innovative about it. The Renaissance was beginning to whisper its way through Europe, bringing with it new ideas about art, science, and apparently torture. Because if you're going to publicly execute someone, you might as well make it architecturally interesting. Let's start with something relatively straightforward. Hanging. You'd think hanging would be simple, right? A rope, a tree, gravity does its thing. But no, the 15th century had opinions about hanging. In England, they had this delightful variation called hanging, drawing, and quartering, which was specifically reserved for men convicted of high treason. And when I say it was reserved for high treason, I mean they really wanted you to know you'd upset the king. The process went like this. First, you'd be dragged through the streets on a wooden hurdle, which is essentially a fence panel, because apparently walking to your own execution was too dignified. You'd be hanged, but not until you were dead, just until you were mostly dead, unconscious ideally, but they weren't too fussy about the timing. Then you'd be cut down and subjected to the drawing part, which is a polite medieval way of saying they removed your internal organs while you were technically still alive. Finally, you'd be divided into 4 parts, or quartered, and those parts would be displayed in different locations around the kingdom as a sort of macabre tourism initiative. The thing is, this wasn't some rare, shocking event. This was standard procedure. They did this to people regularly. There are records of it happening dozens of times throughout the century. In 1440, they did it to a group of men who'd supported the Duke of York during one of England's many internal disagreements about who should wear the fancy hat. The men probably had very strong political opinions that morning. By afternoon, those opinions were being displayed on 4 different city gates. Women, interestingly, were spared this particular indignity, not because medieval society was progressive about gender equality, but because the drawing and quartering process involved a degree of undress that was considered improper for women. So instead, women convicted of high treason were burned at the stake, which tells you everything you need to know about 15th century priorities. Public nudity, shocking. Public immolation, perfectly fine. Burning at the stake was actually quite popular in the 1400s, and not just for treason. Heresy was the big one. The 15th century was absolutely obsessed with heresy. The Catholic Church was in the middle of several theological meltdowns, and anyone who had a slightly different interpretation of Scripture was liable to become kindling. Take Jan Hus, for example. He was a Czech priest and philosopher who had the audacity to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the church had become a bit too corrupt. He pointed out that church officials were selling salvation, living in absurd luxury, and generally behaving like the exact opposite of what Jesus had recommended. Reasonable observations, you'd think. The church disagreed. In 1415, they invited him to the Council of Constance to discuss his views. They promised him safe conduct. He went. They arrested him immediately, because of course they did, tried him for heresy, and burned him at the stake. His last words were reportedly a prayer, which seems remarkably forgiving given the circumstances. But burning wasn't always about heresy. Sometimes it was about witchcraft, which in the 1400s was beginning its long, horrifying ascent into European consciousness. The 1400s were when people really started to get organized about witch hunting. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issued a papal bull acknowledging the existence of witches and authorizing inquisitors to hunt them down. 2 years later, 2 German inquisitors published the Malleus Maleficarum, which translates to the Hammer of Witches, because apparently a reasonable guide to not murdering innocent people wasn't catchy enough. The Malleus Maleficarum is essentially a how-to guide for finding, torturing, and executing witches. It's filled with helpful tips like witches cannot cry, so if she cries, she's faking it, and if she doesn't confess under torture, apply more torture. It became a bestseller, which really says something about 15th century reading tastes. Thousands of people, mostly women, were executed based on the logic in this book. They were accused of causing storms, killing livestock, making men impotent, and generally being responsible for anything bad that happened within a 5-mile radius. The trials themselves were masterpieces of circular reasoning. If you denied being a witch, you were lying because the devil had hardened your heart. If you confessed, well, there you go, you're a witch. If you died under torture, the devil had killed you to prevent you from confessing. If you survived torture, the devil was protecting you, which proved you were a witch. There was literally no way to win. It was like a very deadly game of rock, paper, scissors, where all 3 options were scissors and the scissors were on fire. Let's drift over to France for a moment, because they had their own special contributions to the punishment industry. The French were particularly fond of something called breaking on the wheel, which is exactly as it sounds. The condemned person would be tied to a large wooden wheel, and then an executioner would systematically break their major bones with an iron bar. Arms, legs, ribs, all of it. The idea was that you'd then be left on the wheel to die slowly, your broken body woven through the spokes as a warning to others. They used this method on a man named Pierre Angot in 1432. His crime? He'd stolen some grain during a famine. Let me repeat that. During a famine, when people were starving, this man took some grain to feed himself, and the authorities decided the appropriate response was to shatter every major bone in his body and leave him to die of exposure and shock on a wheel in the town square. The punishment took several days. Pierre Angot spent his final hours as a public spectacle, his screams a form of entertainment for some, a cautionary tale for others. The wheel was eventually outlawed in most of Europe, but not until the 18th century, which means they kept doing this for another 300 years. 300 years of looking at the wheel and thinking, yes, this seems proportionate and just. In Italy, they had their own special traditions. Venice, that beautiful floating city of canals and Renaissance art, was also home to some deeply creative punishments. They had these 2 columns in St. Mark's Square where they carried out executions. One column had a statue of St. Theodore standing on a crocodile, because Venice had opinions about aesthetic presentation even when killing people. But the Venetians weren't satisfied with ordinary executions. They developed a punishment called quarantia, which involved suspending someone in a cage over the Piazza San Marco for 40 days. You weren't fed properly, you weren't sheltered from the elements, you just hung there, slowly starving and dehydrating while the city went about its business below you. Sometimes you were hung in pieces, sometimes you were hung alive. It depended on what you'd done and how annoyed the authorities were. They did this to a man named Baiamonte Tiepolo, who'd attempted a coup against the Venetian government in 1310. Now, this was technically 14th century, but the punishment remained popular through the 1400s. After Tiepolo's failed rebellion, the Venetians didn't just execute him, they demolished his house, salted the earth where it had stood, and erected a column of infamy on the spot. Then they hung the bodies of his co-conspirators in cages around the city as decorative elements. Nothing says successful republic like corpse interior design. Let's talk about boiling for a moment. Yes, boiling, as in they put people in large containers of water or oil and heated it until the person cooked to death. England made this an official method of execution in 1531, which is technically 16th century, but they were practicing informally throughout the 1400s. It was specifically designated for poisoners because apparently the punishment should match the crime, and if you killed someone by putting something toxic in their food, you should die by becoming the food. A man named Richard Roos was the first official victim of the boiling statute. He was a cook who'd poisoned some porridge at the Bishop of Rochester's household in 1531. Parliament passed a law making poisoning a form of treason specifically so they could boil him. They placed him in a large pot at Smithfield, lit a fire underneath, and boiled him to death in front of a crowd. The execution took 2 hours. 2 hours of gradually increasing heat, of skin blistering and flesh cooking, all while spectators watched and presumably wondered about their lunch plans. But here's the thing about 15th century punishments. They weren't just about the death, they were about the message. Every execution was a piece of theater, carefully staged to communicate something about power, authority, and the consequences of stepping out of line. The cruelty was the point. The public nature was the point. The lingering, agonizing deaths were the point. Towns would announce executions in advance. People would gather, sometimes thousands of them, to watch someone die. They'd bring their children. They'd pack lunches. Vendors would set up stalls selling food and drink because nothing says family outing like watching someone get dismembered while eating a meat pie. The executioner was often a local celebrity, someone whose skill at their craft was discussed and critiqued like a performance art piece. And the condemned played their part too. There was this whole ritual around execution speeches. You were expected to admit your guilt, praise the justice of the authorities, and warn others not to follow your path. Even if you'd been tortured into confessing something you didn't do, even if the charges were transparently political, you were supposed to stand there and validate the system that was about to kill you. Some people refused, which was considered deeply poor form. Others gave speeches that lasted half an hour, finding subtle ways to protest their innocence while technically following the script. In Spain, the Inquisition was really hitting its stride in the 15th century. They'd been officially established in 1478 by Ferdinand and Isabella, those famous monarchs who funded Christopher Columbus and decided Spain would be better off with its Jewish and Muslim populations. The Inquisition was technically about rooting out heresy among converted Christians, but it quickly became a tool of terror, control, and convenient property confiscation. The Inquisition had this ceremony called an auto da fe, which translates to act of faith, and it was essentially a massive public sentencing event. They'd round up everyone they'd convicted, sometimes dozens of people, and march them through the streets in special garments called sanbenicos. These were basically humiliation smocks covered in flames and demons if you'd been sentenced to death, or just crosses if you'd gotten off lighter. Then there'd be a big ceremony with lots of religious pageantry, and at the end, sentences would be read out. Some people would be reconciled with the church after public penance, others would be burned alive. The burnings happened at a separate location called the quemadero, or burning place, because apparently burning people in the church square was a bridge too far, even for the Inquisition. They'd tie you to a stake, pile wood around you, and light a fire. If you were lucky, you'd be strangled first, which was considered a mercy and was sometimes granted to people who repented at the last moment. If you weren't lucky, you'd burn conscious, which could take 20 minutes or more, depending on how the fire was built. Tomás de Torquemada, the first Grand Inquisitor, was particularly enthusiastic about his job. During his 15 years in office, from 1483 to 1498, he oversaw the execution of about 2,000 people. That's not counting the thousands more who were punished in other ways, exiled, imprisoned, financially ruined. Torquemada was so zealous about finding heretics that he reportedly slept with a guard dog and kept a bodyguard at all times because he was convinced heretics were plotting to assassinate him. Which they probably were, to be fair. When you burn that many people, you tend to accumulate enemies. Let's meander over to the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor Roman, nor particularly imperial, but which did excel at creative punishment. They had a thing called the Judas cradle, which I'm not going to describe in detail because this is supposed to help you sleep, not haunt your nightmares, but let's just say it involved a pyramid-shaped seat and gravity, and leave it at that. Suffice to say, it was not a comfortable piece of furniture. The Germans also perfected something called the Iron Maiden, though there's some debate about whether these actually happened or were more of a Victorian invention for museum displays. But the 15th century definitely had iron cages and restraints that served similar purposes. There was a famous case in Nuremberg where they kept a prisoner in an iron cage so small he couldn't stand or lie down for several days. He died, naturally, and the authorities were apparently surprised, as if slowly crushing someone to death in a metal box might have predictable outcomes.
Prisons in the 1400s were not like modern prisons. They weren't about rehabilitation or even really about punishment through confinement. They were holding areas where you waited for your actual punishment, which was usually physical. You might be held in a dungeon until your trial, and then you'd be taken out, whipped, branded, mutilated, or executed depending on what you'd done. Long-term imprisonment was rare and usually reserved for political prisoners who were too important to execute, but too dangerous to release. The Tower of London was filling up with such prisoners throughout the 15th century. It was where you put people who were noble enough that you couldn't just behead them in public without diplomatic consequences, but problematic enough that you couldn't let them wander around free. They'd spend years, sometimes decades, locked in relatively comfortable rooms, writing poetry and going quietly insane from isolation. Some of them were eventually executed anyway. Others just died of natural causes while still imprisoned, their entire lives consumed by dynastic politics they'd barely participated in.
Speaking of the Tower, let's talk about beheading for a moment, because that was considered the aristocratic way to go. If you were noble, you got the axe or the sword. Quick, relatively painless, dignified. If you were common, you got hanged or worse. This class distinction in execution methods tells you a lot about how 15th century society viewed death and dignity. Your social status determined not just how you lived, but how you were allowed to die. But beheading wasn't always quick. It depended on the executioner's skill and the sharpness of the blade. There are records of botched beheadings that took multiple strikes, 3, 4, 5 blows before the head finally came off, each one leaving the condemned person in unimaginable agony while the crowd watched and the executioner presumably regretted his career choices. The worst recorded beheading took 11 strikes, 11 times the axe came down. By the end, it was less an execution and more a butchering. In 1483, James Tyrrell was granted a special mercy by Richard III. He could be beheaded by sword rather than axe. The sword was considered superior because it was sharper and could be swung with more force, theoretically guaranteeing a single-stroke execution. The French were particularly good at this. French executioners trained for years to perfect the single-stroke beheading. They were professionals, specialists, and they took pride in their work, which is a deeply strange thing to take pride in, but the 15th century was full of deeply strange things. Let's drift towards some of the more unusual punishments, the ones that weren't necessarily about death, but about humiliation and social destruction. Stocks and pillories were everywhere in 15th century towns. The stocks held your feet while you sat. The pillory held your head and hands while you stood. And then the community would express their opinions about your crimes by throwing things at you. Rotten vegetables were traditional. Stones were not uncommon. Sometimes human waste made an appearance. You'd stand there for hours, sometimes days, unable to dodge or protect yourself, while your neighbors pelted you with garbage and insults. And these weren't reserved for serious crimes. You could end up in the pillory for selling watered-down beer, for being a scold, for charging unfair prices at your shop. Minor infractions met with public degradation. Women who were considered too argumentative or gossipy could be subjected to the scold's bridle, also called a branx. This was a metal cage that locked around your head with a plate that pressed down on your tongue, making it impossible to speak. You'd be led through town wearing this device, a walking advertisement that you'd talked too much and needed to be silenced. The humiliation was the punishment. The message was clear. Women should be quiet, and if you weren't quiet voluntarily, society had tools to make you quiet. Mutilation was another popular option. Cutting off ears, noses, hands, feet. These were all standard punishments throughout the 1400s. If you were caught stealing, you might lose a hand. If you lied in court, you might lose your tongue. If you poached on royal lands, you might lose various appendages depending on how many times you'd been caught.
These punishments served a dual purpose. First, they were painful, obviously, but second, and perhaps more importantly, they marked you permanently as a criminal. You couldn't hide what you'd done. Your missing hand or ear announced to everyone you met that you were a thief or a liar or a poacher. You carried your punishment with you for the rest of your life, which in the 15th century effectively meant social and economic death, even if you'd survived the physical ordeal. In 1450, a man named John Cade led a rebellion in England against Henry VI. It didn't go well. After the rebellion failed, Cade was killed, but that wasn't enough. They beheaded his corpse, quartered it, and displayed the pieces around London. Then they tracked down his followers, about 30 men, and executed them all. Most were hanged, drawn, and quartered. A few were just hanged. One man, who'd been particularly vocal in his support of Cade, had his tongue cut out before he was hanged, just to make extra sure he wouldn't say anything else problematic. The Wars of the Roses, which dominated English politics in the second half of the 15th century, produced an absolute feast of executions. When one side won a battle, they'd execute the leaders of the other side. Then, when the situation reversed, the new winners would execute the previous winners. It was a cycle of aristocratic slaughter that went on for decades. Family members turned on each other. Cousins executed cousins. Brothers fought brothers. And all of them, every single one, died absolutely convinced they were in the right and their enemies were traitors deserving death. Edmund, Earl of Rutland, was 17 when he was killed during the Wars of the Roses in 1460. His father, the Duke of York, had just lost the Battle of Wakefield. Edmund fled the battlefield but was caught by Lord Clifford, who killed him despite his pleas for mercy, or possibly because of them. Clifford's father had died fighting the Duke of York, and revenge was considered perfectly reasonable in the 15th century. Edmund's head was cut off and displayed on the gates of York, next to his father's head, both of them wearing paper crowns in mockery of their royal ambitions. Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI's queen, was reportedly present when several Yorkist nobles were executed after the Battle of Wakefield. She supposedly clapped and laughed as their heads were struck off, though these accounts come from Yorkist chroniclers who had every reason to make her look cruel. But even if the story isn't literally true, the fact that it was believable tells you something about the casual brutality of the period. The idea that a queen might enjoy watching her enemies die wasn't shocking, it was just politics. In France, they were dealing with their own dynastic nightmares. Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in 1431, which technically we've already mentioned burning, but Joan's case deserves its own moment because it was so transparently political. She was a peasant girl who'd led French armies to several victories against the English during the 100 Years' War. Then she was captured by Burgundian forces, sold to the English, tried for heresy and witchcraft by a French ecclesiastical court that was heavily influenced by the English, and burned alive in Rouen. Her trial was a sham. The evidence was nonsense. The charges included wearing men's clothing, which was apparently heretical, and claiming to hear voices from God, which was only acceptable if you were an officially sanctioned mystic approved by the church. Joan was 19 when they burned her. They tied her to a stake in the old market square, piled wood high around her, and lit it. It took about 30 minutes for her to die. Afterward, they burned her body 2 more times to ensure there were no relics left, then threw her ashes in the Seine.
25 years later, the French decided maybe they'd been a bit hasty. They held a retrial, declared her innocent, and eventually canonized her as a saint. But that didn't help Joan, who'd spent half an hour burning to death because she'd been politically inconvenient. The rehabilitation of her reputation was about French national identity, not about justice. The people who'd condemned her were all dead by then anyway, having faced no consequences for executing an innocent teenager. Let's meander back to England for a moment, because they had this delightful practice called pressing. If you were accused of a crime and refused to enter a plea, refused to say either guilty or not guilty, you couldn't be tried. But the authorities weren't about to let you escape punishment through this legal loophole, so they developed a workaround. They'd strip you naked, lay you on the ground, place a wooden board on top of you, and pile stones on the board until you either agreed to plead or died. This was called peine forte et dure, which is French for strong and hard punishment, because apparently even torture needed a sophisticated name. The weight would be increased gradually, day by day. First, you couldn't breathe properly. Then your ribs would start to crack. Then your internal organs would be crushed. All the while, you'd be given minimal food and water, just enough to keep you alive for the process. If you held out long enough without pleading, you'd die, but your property wouldn't be forfeited to the crown because you'd never been convicted. so some people chose this agonizing death to protect their family's inheritance. The most famous case is probably Margaret Clitheroe in 1586, which is 16th century, but they were doing this throughout the 1400s too. There are records of men choosing to be pressed to death rather than plead, lying there under increasing weight, bones breaking, blood coming from their nose and mouth, all to preserve their family's property rights. The 15th century had interesting ideas about family loyalty. Exile was another punishment, though it's hard to know if it was better or worse than the alternatives. If you were exiled from your town or country, you lost everything. Your property was confiscated, your family stayed behind, you became a wanderer with no legal protection, which in the 15th century meant you were basically prey for anyone who wanted to rob or kill you. Outlaws weren't romantic figures living in the forest. They were desperate people who'd been cut off from society and left to die slowly of exposure, starvation, or violence. Robin Hood mythology aside, being an outlaw in the 1400s was a death sentence that just took longer than most. You had no rights. Anyone could kill you without legal consequences. You couldn't work legitimately, couldn't seek help from authorities, couldn't enter towns. You lived in the margins, in forests and wastes, stealing what you could and trying to avoid being caught. Most outlaws died within a year or two, killed by bounty hunters, frozen in winter, starved, or executed if they were captured. Let's drift over to the persecution of Jews in 15th century Europe, because that's a particularly dark thread running through this period. Anti-Jewish violence and legal persecution were constant throughout the 1400s. Jews were expelled from various regions, forced to wear identifying badges, restricted in their professions, blamed for plagues and famines, and subjected to periodic massacres. In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella expelled all Jews from Spain who refused to convert to Christianity. About 200,000 people were given 4 months to leave. They had to sell their property at whatever price they could get, which was basically nothing because everyone knew they were desperate. They were forbidden to take gold or silver with them. They left with whatever they could carry, and many died during the journey to other countries. Those who stayed and converted to Christianity, the conversos, were never fully trusted and were frequent targets of the Inquisition. In 1475, the entire Jewish population of Trent in what's now Italy was arrested after a Christian child named Simonino disappeared. The Jews were accused of ritual murder, the blood libel, that persistent lie that Jews killed Christian children for their blood. They were tortured until they confessed. Then they were executed, all of them, men, women, even some children, burned at the stake or beheaded. The Christian child was made a saint, and his cult was popular for centuries. It took until 1965 for the Catholic Church to officially admit the whole thing was nonsense and remove Simonino from the calendar of saints. These weren't isolated incidents. They happened over and over throughout the century. A child would disappear, Jews would be blamed, confessions would be extracted through torture, and executions would follow. The confessions were always the same because the torture was designed to produce specific answers. The pattern was so reliable that you could predict exactly what the accused would confess to before they even started torturing them. The Hussites, followers of Jan Hus, who we mentioned earlier, spent decades fighting religious wars in Bohemia after their leader was burned at the stake. The Hussite wars lasted from 1419 to 1434, and they were brutal. Catholics and Hussites massacred each other with enthusiasm. Towns were sacked, populations were slaughtered, prisoners were executed en masse. One particularly nasty incident involved Catholic forces capturing a Hussite priest, cutting his hands off, and then burning him alive. The Hussites responded by capturing Catholic priests and burning them in retaliation. Everyone was very religious and very convinced God was on their side. Torture, of course, was an integral part of the justice system. It wasn't some dark secret carried out in hidden dungeons. It was official policy. If you were accused of a crime and the evidence wasn't conclusive, they'd torture you until you confessed. The logic was that innocent people wouldn't confess even under torture, and guilty people would. This logic ignored the obvious fact that everyone eventually confesses under torture, innocent or guilty, and that people will confess to literally anything if you hurt them enough. The rack was popular. You'd be tied to a frame and slowly stretched until your joints dislocated and your ligaments tore. The strappado involved tying your hands behind your back, attaching a rope to your wrists, and then hauling you up so you hung by your arms with your shoulders dislocated. Sometimes they'd drop you part way and stop you suddenly, which would cause additional damage. Sometimes they'd add weights to your feet to increase the strain. Thumb screws did what the name suggests. They crushed your thumbs in a vise. There were also foot screws, head screws, various screws for various body parts. The Spanish Inquisition particularly enjoyed waterboarding, though they called it toca. They'd tie you to an inclined board with your head lower than your feet, put a cloth over your face, and pour water on it so you felt like you were drowning, over and over, until you confessed, or passed out, or died. Confessions obtained through torture were legally valid. They were considered evidence. The fact that torture produces unreliable confessions because people will say anything to make it stop didn't seem to bother anyone. Or rather, it probably bothered the people being tortured, but their opinions weren't really sought.
Let's talk about animal trials for a moment, because the 15th century was weird enough that they put animals on trial for crimes. If a pig killed a child, the pig would be arrested, imprisoned, tried in court with a lawyer appointed for its defense, and if found guilty, executed by the same methods used for humans. Hanged usually, though occasionally they'd burn them or bury them alive. There were records of dozens of these trials throughout the 1400s. A sow in Savigny in 1457 was tried and convicted of killing a child. She was sentenced to be hanged by her hind feet from a tree. Her 6 piglets were accused of being accomplices, but were acquitted due to their youth and because there was no evidence they'd participated in the killing. They were returned to their owner, who had to promise to keep them under control. In 1474, a rooster in Basel was accused of laying an egg, which was apparently evidence of satanic influence because roosters aren't supposed to lay eggs. The rooster was tried for witchcraft, found guilty, and burned at the stake along with the egg. The trial records indicate the prosecution argued that the egg, if hatched, would produce a cockatrice, a mythical serpent that could kill with a glance. The defense argued the rooster couldn't be held responsible for biological irregularities. The prosecution won. These trials weren't jokes. They were serious legal proceedings with real lawyers and judges and formal records. The animals were treated exactly like human defendants, which should tell you something about how seriously people took their legal rituals, even when applying them to pigs and roosters. The executions were public events. People gathered to watch pigs hang. They threw stones at condemned cows. The entire community participated in punishing livestock for crimes. Insects and rodents were also tried, usually when there were plagues of them destroying crops. The courts would summon the rats or weevils to appear, and when they inevitably didn't show up, they'd be tried in absentia. Sometimes they'd be excommunicated. Sometimes they'd be ordered to leave the region within a certain number of days or face unspecified consequences. It never worked, of course, but it gave communities a sense that they were doing something about their problems, that there was an authority that could impose order even on nature.